The Justice Department filing documents to represent President Trump in a defamation lawsuit. Last year, advice columnist E. Jean Carroll accused the president of raping her at a New York City hotel back in the mid-90s. Carroll filed the defamation suit in November after Trump denied her allegation. NBC News Justice correspondent Julia Ainsley is outside the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. Julia, kind of a head-scratcher here. The Justice Department's supposed to act as an independent federal law enforcement agency. A lot of people wondering, then how can it represent the president in what seems like a personal case?
Well, Allison, what they're leaning on here is known as the Federal Tort Claims Act. That is usually the way the Justice Department goes about defending a federal employee if they've been acting in their capacity as an elected official. In this case, they're saying that the president was acting in his capacity as an elected official when he said that he had never met E. Jean Carroll at a press conference last year. That, of course, triggered the defamation lawsuit in New York State, where E. Jean Carroll said that was a lie, and she sued him. Now, once that case got to a place of discovery, in other words, they wanted the president to hand over more information, they wanted DNA samples, all of a sudden the DOJ has reached their hand into this, used that Federal Tort Claims Act I talked about, and said, we are now protecting him as someone doing the business of the government, of an elected official, even though what he talked about was so personal. And they've pointed to other times where the federal government has intervened when people have talked to the media before and been sued. But in this case, you also have to look at the cases where they didn't intervene, and one would be with Bill Clinton. The Justice Department never came to his side for lies that he said about Paula Jones. This is pretty unprecedented, but we did see the Attorney General Bill Barr speak about this matter earlier today in Chicago.
Elected officials in our democracy, a representative democracy, when they're answering questions in office, even about personal affairs, any defamation claim is subject to Westfall. So this was a normal application of the law. The law is clear. It is done frequently.
But I mean, Allison, I've spoken to people who sat inside this Justice Department in administrations past in the civil division, in the very division that would be asked to intervene in this case, and they say that they are all just aghast at this decision today to reach in and get involved in something so personally close to the president. And we've also seen E. Jean Carroll herself step out and make remarks. She tweeted today, "Sir, I and my attorney, Robbie Kaplan, are ready. So is every woman who has ever been silenced. So is every American citizen who has been trampled by Bill Barr and the DOJ. Bring it," she says in all caps. So we're really squaring off now to see how the Justice Department plans, how far they plan to go to defend Trump in this case. And really, we're waiting to see what a judge, whichever judge gets this case in the Southern District of New York, will decide whether or not the Justice Department has standing to intervene in this case.
So, Julia, we heard E. Jean Carroll say there that she and her legal team are ready. Do we know what they're ready for next, how this case will proceed, or do we have to wait and see a few things first?
Yeah, so we'll have to wait and see what the Southern District of New York says. But, you know, she's right in the fact that the Justice Department has intervened to block discovery. There was another statement earlier today that her and her lawyer put out saying that it is only now that Trump was asked to hand over more information that all of a sudden the Justice Department has kicked in. So we'll wait to see what they say in the Southern District of New York. The most extreme that we could see, but legal experts I've talked to doubt this would happen, would be that the Southern District of New York would say, yes, the Justice Department has standing here. Yes, they can defend the president on this very personal matter. And also that because now it's not just about the president, but it's about the federal government. And by law, you cannot sue the federal government for defamation. Therefore, the case would be dismissed. That seems like what the biggest win would be for this Justice Department. But that's what they're hoping for. And that's something that Carroll and her legal team will be watching to see whether or not they even get a chance to come back and make their claims about what happened to her that she's detailed.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.